Winter on the northern plains never arrived politely. It did not announce itself. It did not wait for fences to be finished or roofs to be sealed, and it did not care how certain a man felt about his preparations. In the closing years of the 19th century, settlers across the open territories believed they understood winter. They had endured cold before. They had built cabins with their own hands. Pine logs stacked tight, seams packed with clay and straw, stove firmly against the wall. There was fire inside, there was wood outside, and in the frontier mind. And that meant safety, but some winters were different. Some winters came faster than memory, colder than experience, and longer than any calculation made in daylight. The wind did not simply blow. It searched, it slipped through fibers of wood, through hairline cracks no eye could see, through the very structure of house itself. Snow did not fall gently, it buried, it erased roads and distance. And the cold did not stay outdoors, it pressed inward, patient and relentless. On paper, everything was done right. The cabins followed the accepted pattern. The stoves burned hot. The wood piles stood high. Yet when night fell and the fire began to weaken, dangerous truth emerged. One that frontier families rarely spoke aloud. There were houses with fire that still froze people inside, not because they lacked heat, but because they could not hold it. In the standard log cabin, warmth existed only where the flame could reach few steps away. They turned sharp. Corners stiffened with cold, floors became sinks that drained heat faster than any stove could replace it. And once the fire died, even briefly, temperatures collapsed as if the walls themselves had betrayed those sheltering inside. Children slept restlessly. Elderly lungs struggled in air that bit with every breath. Water froze overnight in basins placed only yards from glowing iron stoves. The solution, settlers believed, was always the same. More wood, more fire, more effort. Few stopped to ask whether the house itself was the problem. While most families rushed to raise cabins as quickly as possible before the ground locked solid, one man chose slower path. His name was Caleb Holt. He did not hurry, he doubted the danger of winter, but because he questioned the assumptions everyone else accepted without challenge. Caleb did not see winter as an enemy to be fought with flame alone. He saw it as force governed by rules of mass, wind, time, and material. While others counted safety in cords of firewood, he measured it in wall thickness and in how long structure could remember warmth after the fire was gone. Neighbors called his thinking impractical. They said overbuilding for fear. They said frontier life had always been cold, and always would be. But winter did not care what men said. It only tested what they built. And when the first great storm arrived without warning, when wind erased landmarks and cold crushed confidence, the difference between surviving and enduring would come down to simple, unforgiving truth. On the frontier, it was never the cold alone that killed people. It was the belief that good enough wood enough. On the frontier, there was a right way to build a cabin. At least that was what everyone believed. The design was simple, familiar, and proven by repetition. Logs were cut straight from nearby stands of pine or cottonwood, usually 10 to 12 inches thick, stacked 7 courses high, notched tight at the corners. Gaps were packed with whatever could be found: mud, grass, straw, sometimes even scraps of cloth. Single iron stove or small fireplace was set against wall, its pipe rising straight through the roof. It was the cabin nearly every family lived in. It was the cabin fathers taught sons to build, and it was the cabin that settlers trusted with their lives. From the outside, these structures looked solid: thick walls, low ceilings, small windows. Everything about them suggested protection. When the stove burned hot, the room closest to the fire felt almost comfortable, even cheerful. Boots dried near the hearth, supper simmered, frost melted from coats hung near the heat. But comfort in these cabins was deceptive. Warmth did not belong to the house. It belonged only to the fire. The moment flames weakened, the illusion collapsed. Heat rose quickly to the ceiling and vanished. Floors turned bitterly cold, pulling warm from the air and from bare feet alike. Corners stiffened first, then the far wall, then the center of the room. Within hours, temperatures fell so sharply that families learned to wake through the night, not from fear, but from cold, just to feed the stove again. Settlers accepted this as normal. Cold mornings were considered part of frontier life. Frozen wash water was expected. Sleeping in layers, wearing coats indoors, sharing body heat under quilts, treated as signs of toughness, not warning signs of failure. If a house grew cold, the answer was always the same: burn more wood, and so they did. And rose before daylight to split logs in the dark. Children hauled armloads of fuel inside. Entire days were shaped around feeding fires that consumed astonishing amounts of wood while delivering only brief relief. Even then, heat never reached evenly. One side of the room baked while the other hovered, near freezing. A man could sit close enough to scorch his boots while ice formed in a bucket only a few feet away. What few recognized was that these cabins were not truly holding heat at all. They were merely delaying its escape. Wood, for all its thickness, is light. It warms quickly, but it cools just as fast. When pushed through, its fibers found weaknesses and stripped warmth from the walls themselves. Every gust turned the cabin into sieve, draining heat as steadily as it was produced. Yet, because this was the way cabins had always been built, no one questioned it, no one except Caleb Holt. As he moved through neighboring homes, Caleb noticed the same pattern repeated again and again: hot air near the stove, cold air everywhere else, walls that felt like ice by morning, house that demanded constant feeding just to remain barely livable. The problem, realized, was not effort, it was design. The accepted cabin was built to stand up, not to hold warmth. And in mild winters, that difference could be ignored. But when the cold deepened and storms lingered, the limits of the right way became deadly clear. House I could not remember heat forced its occupants into endless labor, growing weaker as fuel disappeared and temperatures fell. Caleb began to understand something his neighbors did not yet see. The frontier cabin wasn't failing because people were lazy or careless. It was failing because everyone had been solving the wrong problem. They were trying to make more heat when what they needed was house that could keep it. Caleb Holt did not arrive on the plains with grand ideas or the confidence of a man who believed he had all the answers. He arrived with habits formed long before he ever set foot on open prairie, habits of watching how buildings aged, how walls behaved after the fire went out, how cold lingered or faded depending on what structure was made of. As young man, Caleb had spent years around old stone farm buildings and root cellars, places winter behaved differently. Where frost pressed hard outside yet never quite made it through, he remembered cellars where potatoes stayed firm and unfrozen even in the deepest cold. Kitchens where single morning fire carried warmth well into the night, thick walls that felt cool in summer and strangely warm in winter long after the hearth had gone dark. Those memories stayed with him. So when Caleb built his first log cabin on the frontier, he followed the accepted pattern. But he paid attention. He noticed how quickly the room cooled once the stove was damped down. He felt the walls at dawn cold enough to sting the skin. He watched the wind shake heat loose from the house as easily as it stripped leaves from trees. Other men shrugged this off. Caleb wrote it down, and he tracked how long warmth lasted after the fire died. He measured how much wood disappeared in a single week of hard weather. He noted how the cabin warmed fast, but forgot just as quickly. To him, the house behaved less like shelter and more like thin shell, briefly resisting winter before surrendering. When spring finally came and neighbors turned their attention to breaking sod and planting crops, Caleb did something else. He walked his land slowly, studying the scattered field stone left behind by ancient ice. He lifted heavy pieces, testing their weight. He pressed his palms against them on cold mornings and warm afternoons. He noticed how long they held the sun's warmth after dusk. While others measured progress in acres plowed, Caleb measured it in understanding. That was when the comments began. Men passing by shook their heads at the growing piles of stone. They calculated lost time. Out days that should have been spent farming, hauling, improving. They called the effort impractical, excessive. Luxury no working settler could afford. You can't eat stone. Oh, one neighbor said. Caleb did not argue. He rarely explained himself. Frontier life taught men to mind their own work, and he let others do the same. But inside, he was assembling a different picture of survival, one not centered on speed but on endurance. He wasn't trying to outbuild. He was trying to outlast it. Caleb understood something that experience, not tradition, had taught him. Winter punished houses that relied on constant effort. Home that demanded endless fuel would eventually fail, because people tired, wood ran out, and storms lasted longer than expected. The question was not how hot house could get. The question was how slowly it could grow cold. By the time neighbors realized Caleb was serious, by the time stone replaced plowing in his daily routine, it was already too late to change his mind. He was building for winter no one wanted to imagine, and soon enough the plains would deliver exactly that kind of winter. The first deep cold arrived quietly. There was no great storm to announce it, no wall of clouds racing across the sky. The day faded clear and still, the kind of calm that often fooled settlers into believing winter would be manageable. But as darkness settled over the plains, the temperature dropped with a speed that caught even experienced frontiersmen off guard. Inside Caleb Holt's cabin, the stove glowed red, the fire was strong. The iron sides radiated. Supper had been eaten, boots set near the hearth to dry. By every visible measure, the house should have been warm, and yet as the hours passed, something felt wrong. The air near the stove remained hot enough to dry leather, but beyond that small circle, the room cooled steadily. The far wall turned sharp with cold. The floor stiffened beneath bare feet. When Caleb pressed his hand against the logs near the door, the wood felt like ice. By midnight, the fire began to weaken. Caleb banked it carefully, just as he had been taught. He closed the draft, settled the coals, and trusted the stove to carry them through the night. And he lay down, listening as the wind rose outside, searching the seams of the cabin with quiet persistence. Before dawn, the cold woke him, and not suddenly, but gradually, as if the room itself were draining away its last warmth. His breath formed faint clouds in the dark. The air pressed cold against his chest with every inhale. He rose and stepped from his bed. The floor bit hard enough to force sharp breath from his lungs. The fire was still alive, but the house was already failing. By morning, the truth was undeniable. Water in the wash basin had frozen solid. Frost clung to the inside walls, blooming white across the logs. The stove burned again, once fed, but the warmth it produced vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Caleb stood quietly, watching heat rise and disappear. That morning, as neighbors talked about the cold with resigned humor, about burning more wood, about winter testing them, Caleb felt something else entirely. He felt clarity. Fire was not protection. Fire was effort. And effort could not sustain forever. The cabin demanded constant feeding like living thing, and the moment attention slipped, the cold reclaimed everything. It was not shelter that worked with its occupants. It was structure that fought against them. Caleb understood then what most men never stopped to consider. House that only worked while you were awake was not a house built for winter. The danger was not that the fire might go out. The danger was that the cabin itself offered no resistance. It did, and no memory of warmth, no stored energy, nothing to slow the cold's advance. That night changed the way Caleb thought about survival. He stopped asking how much wood man could burn in winter. He began asking how much heat house could hold when the fire was gone, and that question lay the beginning of solution that would soon separate those who endured the coming winter from those who did not. The answer did not come from a book. It came from a structure that should not have worked, at least not by frontier logic. Late that winter, Caleb spent night away from his cabin while traveling supply route that followed the river bottoms. As dusk settled, he was offered shelter in low, earth-covered dwellings set back from the wind. From the outside, it looked crude. The entrance was narrow. The walls were thick and heavy, packed with soil and sod rather than timber. Inside, small fire burned at the center, not roaring blaze, not stove-fed hour after hour. Just modest fire, steady and restrained, yet the air inside felt different. Caleb noticed it immediately. The warmth did not gather near the flame and vanish upward. It surrounded him evenly, quietly. The walls, dark with earth, felt warm to the touch, warmer than the air itself. Long after the fire was reduced to glowing coals, the space remained comfortable. Hours passed. The fire faded. The warmth stayed. An older man watching Caleb study the walls with craftsman's focus spoke in simple terms that carried more truth than explanation ever could. These walls drink the fire, he said. Then they give it back slow. Oh, that sentence stayed with Caleb. He began to understand what the frontier cabins were missing. Not effort, not fuel, but mass. The earth-walled structure worked because it did not rush. It absorbed heat gradually, released it just as slowly, smoothing the violent swings between hot and cold that plagued log cabins. The house behaved like reservoir. Caleb thought back to the stone buildings of his youth. Root cellars dug deep into hillsides where vegetables never froze. Farm kitchens where morning warmth lingered well past sunset. Thick walls that did not react quickly, but remembered everything. These structures were not fighting winter. They were cooperating with physics. On the plains, the log cabin acted like thin skin, quick to warm, quicker to lose heat. The earth lodge worked differently. It stored energy in sheer weight. It resisted wind not through tight seams alone, but through depth and inertia. Caleb saw then what he had missed before. Heat was not something you chased with fire, something you captured and allowed to move on its own time. That night, lying on packed earth beneath sod-covered roof, Caleb slept without waking once to feed flame. The fire had gone dark hours before dawn, yet the room remained above the cold. His breath stayed clear. His body rested. When morning came, the lesson was complete. House did not need to be hot all the time and needed to cool slowly. As Caleb stepped back out into the biting air, the idea took fully. Frontier cabin could be more than a box around fire. It could become tool. One that stored warmth, resisted wind, and bought precious hours when fuel ran low or storms trapped families indoors. From that moment on, Caleb no longer thought of walls as barriers. He thought of them as batteries. And once that idea took root, there was no turning back. Most men on the frontier believed heat and fire were the same thing. If the fire burned hot, the house was warm. If the fire died, the cold won. It felt obvious. Flames produced heat. Wood fed flames. More wood meant more warmth. That logic had carried families through countless winters. Until it did. What Caleb Holt had begun to understand was something simpler and far more dangerous to ignore. Fire creates heat, but it does not hold it the moment flame burns. Heat starts moving away from it. Hot air rises and escapes. Cold air pushes in to replace it in light structure, like log cabin, and there's almost nothing to slow that process. Wood warms quickly, but it cools just as fast. Wind strips heat from its surface. Gaps in fibers pull warmth outward like wick draws oil. The result is house that must be fed constantly just to remain livable. Thermal mass works differently. Heavy materials, earth, thick masonry, absorb heat slowly. They do not react instantly to changes in temperature. When warmed, they store energy deep within their structure, releasing it gradually over many hours. The heavier the mass, the longer the process takes. Caleb thought of it like water. You can boil thin pan dry in minutes, but deep barrel of water holds its heat long after the fire is gone. Log cabin behaved like the pan, and earth-walled structure behaved like barrel. In winter, this difference meant survival. When fire burned inside house with mass, heat soaked into the walls instead of rushing out into the night. When the fire died, the walls became the source of warmth, radiating energy back into the room evenly, silently, without effort. This was why earth lodges stayed warm with small fires, why stone cellars never froze, why thick-walled buildings felt alive long after the hearth went cold. Even the way heat moved inside these spaces was different. In a standard cabin, warmth clustered near the stove while corners froze, but in a structure with mass, every surface became part of the heating system. Walls radiated gently, temperature differences shrank, cold pockets disappeared, the house itself worked. Caleb also understood another critical point most settlers missed. Mass did not just store heat, it resisted change. When outside temperatures plunged suddenly, heavy walls slowed the cold's advance. Winds howled, they could not strip heat away quickly. Structure with mass bought time. Hours that could mean the difference between waking up alive or not waking up at all. This was not theory, it was physics that had protected people for centuries, long before iron stoves and sawn lumber ever reached the frontier. It was the reason ancient buildings still stood warm in winter and cool in summer. Caleb did not need equations to understand it, he needed only to feel it. If house could cool slowly, then man did not need to burn wood endlessly. Could remember heat, then fire became tool, not lifeline. That realization changed everything, because once you stop building for heat and start building for heat retention, you stop fighting winter and begin to outlast it. Understanding a problem is one thing, acting on it when everyone around you believes you're wrong is something else entirely. By early spring, the worst of the cold had loosened its grip on the plains. Snow retreated into muddy fields, and men turned their attention back to plows, fences, and planting schedules. Survival gave way to productivity, and the rhythm of frontier life resumed its familiar pace. Caleb Holt did not follow that rhythm. While neighbors measured progress and acres turned and seed sown, Caleb measured distances around his cabin. He paced off ground with deliberate steps. Marking lines extended well beyond his existing walls. He knelt in the soil, scratching rough diagrams with stick, thinking in thickness and weight rather than speed. The plan forming in his mind was simple in principle and radical in practice. He would surround his existing log cabin with mass, not replace it and not tear it down, but wrap it, stone gathered from fields and creek beds. Walls built thick enough to resist wind and deep cold, space left between the old structure and the new, allowing heat to move where he wanted it and moisture to escape where it must. It was house built around another house. The idea drew attention quickly. Men stopped as they passed, watching stone piles grow where furrows should have been. Calculations followed, spoken aloud, meant to persuade how many days of labor it would take, how many bushels of grain would be lost, how much food that effort might buy instead. Winter's already passed. They said, build fast next time. Cut more wood. One neighbor laughed outright. Another called a waste of good season. A third offered advice that carried the weight of tradition. Frontier life was cold by nature, and trying to change that was foolish. Caleb listened. He did not argue, because he understood something they did not. He was not building for the winter that had just passed. He was building for the winter that arrived without warning. The one that stayed, the one that burned through wood and strength alike. Most settlers prepared for the average year. Caleb prepared for the worst he had seen happen when fire became dependency rather than a supplement. He had felt how quickly house without memory surrendered to cold, and he knew that effort alone could not outlast season that refused to end. Stone demanded labor up front, but it asked for nothing afterward. Wall that held heat did not need to be fed at midnight. Wall that resisted wind did not tire. Wall that cooled slowly gave families time to rest, recover, and survive. Caleb accepted the cost, accepted the lost days, the sore muscles, the quiet judgment of men who believed he was overbuilding for fear. He accepted being called wasteful, because he understood that the frontier punished optimism more harshly than caution. As he lifted the first heavy stones into place, he made his choice final. He would not build for comfort, he would build for endurance. And when the next winter came, as it always did, and the land itself would decide whether that was wisdom or folly. Caleb Holt did not think of his house as walls and the roof. He thought of it as the system. Every mistake he had observed in standard frontier cabins came from the same flaw. Each part worked alone. The stove fought the cold. The walls tried to block the wind. The roof shed snow. None of them supported one another. When one failed, everything failed. Caleb designed differently. The original log cabin remained at the center, no longer exposed directly to the weather. Around it, he planned second skin. Thick, heavy, and deliberate, stone would form the outer defense, not for strength alone, but for weight and memory. Between the logs and stone, he left controlled airspace, not gap for drafts, but buffer that slowed heat loss and allowed moisture to move safely away. The space mattered too tight, and moisture would rot the logs too open, and wind would steal heat. Caleb treated air the way he treated stone, not as emptiness, but as material with rules. The stone walls themselves were built thick, far thicker than frontier norms, not decorative, not precise. Every piece chosen for mass rather than beauty. The stones absorbed heat from the cabin during the day and released it back inward through the night. The log walls no longer faced the wind, they faced warmth. Where the two systems touched, Caleb was careful. He allowed heat to transfer where it helped and separated materials where movement and moisture could cause damage. He understood that stone and wood behaved differently, expanded differently, breathed differently. 6. House did not force them to act the same. The roof was altered next. Caleb extended the eaves so snow and rain fell clear of the stone, protecting the walls from constant wetting. Water, he knew, destroyed more buildings than cold ever could. The dry wall stayed warm. A wet wall bled heat and cracked under frost. Openings were treated with equal care. Windows were kept modest and faced toward the low winter sun. Doorways were shielded from prevailing winds. No opening allowed cold air. A direct path to the heart of the house. Every entrance slowed winters advanced just a little more. Nothing about the design was fast, but nothing was accidental either. The cabin no longer relied on constant fire. The fire now worked with the house instead of against it. Heat moved deliberately. From flame to log, from log to stone, from stone back into the living space. Lost slow, balance emerged. The house began to behave less like shelter, and more like living thing. It warmed gradually. Reluctantly, it resisted sudden change. Caleb had not invented something new. He had assembled old knowledge into complete form. Stone, air, wood, and fire working together instead of competing. For the first time, his cabin was no longer just placed to survive the night. It was ready to face the season. The autumn that followed was dangerously kind. Days stayed warm well past their time. The sky remained open and blue. Fields dried slowly, and many settlers delayed their final preparations, trusting that winter would arrive the way it usually did. Gradual, predictable, forgiving, it did not. The change came in single night. Hard wind swept down from the north, carrying wall of dark cloud that erased the horizon. Temperatures fell so fast at water before dawn. Snow followed, heavy and relentless, driven sideways by gusts that turned open land into white blur. By morning, fences vanished. Roads disappeared. Distance itself seemed to collapse. This was not an early storm meant to pass. It was the beginning of season that refused to loosen its grip. In cabins across the plains, the familiar struggle began immediately. Fires burned around the clock. Stoves glowed red. Men rose through the night to feed flames, devoured wood faster than anyone had planned for. Heat clustered near the hearth and vanished everywhere else. Inside many homes, ice formed on interior walls. Water froze within arm's reach of burning stoves. Dirt floors hardened into frozen slabs that pulled warmth downward, draining every room. Families adapted as they always had. By shrinking their world, they slept close together. They stayed in bed through daylight hours. Children learned not to wander far from fire. Work stopped. Survival replaced living. But the storm did not ease. Week after week, snow continued to fall. Wind scoured the land bare in some places and buried it in others. Supply routes closed. Rail lines vanished beneath drifts. Fuel that settlers had planned to purchase later became unreachable. Woodpiles shrank. Coal ran out. Confidence collapsed. Men began burning what had never been meant for fire. Fence rails, tool handles, outbuildings dismantled piece by piece. Smoke rose from chimneys day and night, yet comfort remained fleeting. The cabins demanded more and more, offering less and less in return. Cold did not kill quickly. It wore people down. Illness followed exhaustion. Lungs weakened. Children coughed through the night. Elderly settlers failed quietly in cabins that could not hold warmth long enough to protect them. Against this backdrop, Caleb Holt's cabin stood silent. No plume of frantic smoke marked it. No constant trips for fuel broke the stillness. The house worked steadily, absorbing heat when it was available and releasing it patiently as the fire faded. While other homes swung wildly between hot and freezing, Caleb's cooled slowly, evenly. The walls themselves radiated warmth. The air stayed calm. Corners remained livable. The difference was not dramatic from the outside, but inside it was everything. As winter deepened into something far worse than anyone had prepared for, the plains began sorting houses by simple rule. Those that could remember heat endured, those that could not, did not. There came a point in that winter when burning less wood was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. Fuel was disappearing everywhere. Wood that had once seemed plentiful now vanished in days. Men counted logs the way they once counted weeks. Every armload mattered. Every fire fed was the calculation. Caleb Holt understood this reality better than most. He had built his cabin to endure. But even endurance had limits. And so he made a decision that no one else on the plains would have dared to make. He would let the fire go out, not by accident, not through neglect, but deliberately. On night when the wind pressed hardest against the walls and the cold reached its deepest bite, Caleb fed the stove heavily before dusk. He loaded it with seasoned hardwood until the iron glowed and the air warmed evenly throughout the cabin. He did not chase heat. He charged it. The stone walls drank deeply. By the time darkness settled fully, the inner surfaces of the walls felt warm to the touch. Not hot, but alive. The kind of warmth that did not rush, promised patience rather than intensity. Then Caleb closed the drafts. He sealed the firebox. And he waited. Hour by hour, the flames faded. Coals dimmed. At last, the stove fell silent. In any other cabin, this would have marked the beginning of desperate night. But here, something different happened. The temperature did not collapse. Warmth continued to move into the room, not from fire, but from the walls themselves. The air cooled slowly, so slowly that it was barely noticeable. The cabin did not fight the cold. It resisted it. Outside, the storm howled without mercy when, at the stone, snow packed against the walls. The cold pressed hard, expecting the house to fail as others had. It did not. By midnight, the interior had cooled only slightly. The floor remained usable. The far corner stayed within the same gentle range as the center of the room. The house radiated, stored heat evenly, without effort, without flame. Caleb slept, and not in short, anxious stretches, but fully when morning came. The stove was cold to the touch. The fire had been gone 4 hours, and yet the cut remained above freezing, dry and livable. Water had not frozen. Breath did not cloud the air. The house had carried him through the night on memory alone. This was the proof Caleb needed, not for others, but for himself. His cabin was no longer dependent on constant labor. It had become thermal reserve, capable of buying time. When fuel ran low and storms refused to pass, on the frontier, time was survival. And Caleb's house had learned how to make it. By midwinter, pride had thinned across the plains. Men who once spoke confidently about preparation now measured their words carefully. Woodpiles had shrunk to shadows of what they once were. Cabins that had seemed solid in autumn now revealed their weakness, one frozen night at a time. The difference between houses could no longer be explained away. In most cabins, fire ruled everything. If the stove burned, people huddled close and stayed warm enough to endure. Weak and cold rushed in immediately. Families lived at the mercy of fuel, waking through the night to keep flames alive, measuring survival in hours rather than days. Caleb Holt's cabin told a different story. Visitors noticed it first in small details. Frost did not creep across the inside walls. Corners remained usable. The air felt steady, not sharp. When people stepped inside from the wind, their bodies relaxed before their minds caught up. There was no feeding of the stove, no constant movement to stay warm, no smell of desperation in the smoke. At first, neighbors tried to explain it away. They said Caleb had better wood. They said he burned more often. They said luck played part. But luck does not repeat itself night after night. When nearby cabin was abandoned after its occupants ran out of fuel, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The empty structure froze solid within hours. Water split container. Frost bloomed thick on the logs. The house became unlivable without immediate and massive effort. Caleb's cabin remained steady. Men began to walk its perimeter quietly, studying the walls. They noticed a thickness, the shelter from wind. The way snow piled harmlessly against stone instead of seeping into seams. They asked careful questions, never admitting doubt, but no longer mocking the work. How long can it stay warm without fire? How much wood are you burning now? Does the stone ever get cold all the way through? Caleb answered plainly. He did not boast. He did not argue. He explained what the house did and what it did not do. He spoke of time, not comfort, of balance, not warmth, of building once rather than fighting forever. What impressed his neighbors most was not that the cabin stayed warm, but that it stayed predictable. While other homes lurched between extremes, Caleb's held steady. It forgave missed feedings. It allowed rest. On the frontier, forgiveness mattered. Quietly, opinion shifted. No one apologized. No one admitted they had been wrong. But the questions kept coming, and in winter that punished every mistake, the answers were written clearly in stone: warmth and survival. On the frontier, useful ideas rarely arrived with ceremony. There were no manuals passed from hand to hand, no lectures, no claims of invention. Knowledge moved the same way people did, slowly, cautiously, and only when survival demanded it. After that winter, men began building differently. Not all at once, not boldly, but in pieces. One settler raised a low stone wall along the north side of his cabin, shielding it from the prevailing wind. Another stacked heavy field stone around the base of his walls, stopping cold air from stripping heat at floor level. Third built stone lined pantry against his cabin. Noticing that the shared wall stayed warmer than any other, none of them said they were copying Caleb Holt. They said they were trying something. The changes were rarely dramatic. Frontiermen did not abandon familiar methods lightly. They adapted what they already knew, adding mass where it made sense, using stone and earth not as decoration but as protection. Root cellars grew deeper and thicker. Some families slept in them during the worst storms, discovering that underground space offered calm that surface cabins could not. Others extended entryways, building short wind passages that trapped cold air before it could rush inside living spaces. Each adjustment was small. Together, they changed everything. The principle spread because they worked. Stone wall that stayed warm overnight needed no explanation. Cabin that burned less wood and stayed livable during storms made its case silently. Caleb became point of reference without becoming teacher. Men asked him about foundation depth while standing near his fence. They inquired about stone placement during chance meetings at the general store. Questions came softly, often framed as curiosity rather than admission. Caleb answered honestly and conservatively. He warned against cutting corners. He emphasized drainage before thickness, patience before speed. He spoke of moisture as an enemy just as dangerous as cold, and of overbuilding as form of humility rather than excess. Build for the winter that breaks things, he told them, not the one that behaves. The ideas traveled farther than the man himself. Passing teamsters carried stories to distant homesteads. Circuit preachers mentioned unusual houses and letters sent back east. Small notes appeared in local papers. Brief mentions of cabins that burned half the wood of their neighbors during the hard winter. No one called it system, but people remembered, and on the frontier, remembered knowledge had a way of resurfacing whenever conditions turned dangerous again. Decades passed. The frontier settled. Railroads replaced wagon trails. Sawmills and factories standardized how houses were built. Speed and uniformity took precedence over patience and mass. The old stone-wrapped cabins faded into the background, their lessons absorbed quietly or forgotten entirely. Then much later, science began asking the same questions frontier builders had once faced. Why did some structures stay warm with little fuel? Why did temperature swings kill comfort more reliably than cold itself? Why did heavy buildings behave differently than light ones? The answers arrived wrapped in new language. Engineers spoke of thermal mass, the ability of material to absorb, store, and release heat over time. Architects described radiant heat, explaining how warmth from surfaces felt different than heat carried by air alone. Researchers studied passive solar design, showing how buildings could capture and retain energy without constant mechanical input. To anyone who had lived through hard winter on the plains, none of this was surprising. Stone, earth, and masonry had always behaved this way. They had simply never been measured in laboratories. Modern tests confirm. Frontier experience had already proven thick walls slowed heat loss. Heavy materials resisted rapid temperature change. Structures that stored warmth reduced fuel demand and stabilized interior conditions even during severe cold. Buildings that cooled slowly were safer buildings. Researchers studying earth-sheltered homes discovered that interior temperatures often remain near 50 to 60 degrees year-round regardless of outside extremes. Studies of historic masonry structures revealed heat retention patterns nearly identical to those Caleb Holt had achieved with fieldstone and careful design. The physics had not changed. Only the explanations had. Today, manufacturers market stone-clad walls and high-mass construction as advanced solutions to modern energy problems. They advertise efficiency, sustainability, and comfort, rarely mentioning that these ideas were once tested under far harsher conditions without instruments, blueprints, or safety nets. On the frontier, mistakes were fatal. Theory was worthless without proof. What Caleb and others like him built was experimental architecture. It was survival engineering, designed to function when fuel was scarce, storms were relentless, and help was weeks away. Modern science did not invent these principles, it rediscovered them, and in doing so, it quietly confirmed truth the frontier had always known. The most reliable solutions are rarely new. They are the ones that have already endured the worst conditions imaginable. The frontier never rewarded comfort, it rewarded preparation. Those who survived the hardest winters were rarely the strongest or the fastest builders. They were the ones willing to accept discomfort early in labor and time, and in the opinions of others, in exchange for safety when it mattered most. Caleb Holt was never remembered as visionary. He was remembered, when he was remembered at all, as man who built slowly, a man who hauled stone when others broke sought, a man who wrapped perfectly good cabin in rock while neighbors shook their heads. He did not chase warmth. He built for endurance. That distinction mattered on the frontier. Optimism killed quietly. The belief that this winter would be like the last one led men to underbuild, underprepare, and overtrust systems that failed the moment conditions turned severe. The settlers who survived were those who assumed winter would be worse than expected, and built accordingly. They were willing to be called foolish first. What Caleb understood was not complicated, but it was profound. Fire is temporary, Effort is limited, human strength fades, but well-built system does not tire. House that remembers heat works while people sleep. Structure that resists change buys time when decisions are slow and fuel is scarce. Design that assumes failure, fire of weather supplied, becomes resilient rather than fragile. These were not abstract ideas. They were lived truths, paid for in labor rather than theory, and they remain relevant. Today, many of the same mistakes in different forms. We build light, fast, and efficient on paper, trusting that energy will always be available, systems will always function, and conditions will remain predictable. A frontier reminds us that predictability is a luxury, not a guarantee. The old builders knew something we're still relearning. You don't build for comfort, you build for survival first. Comfort comes afterward. Caleb's stone-wrapped cabin did not become famous. It did not appear in catalogs or earn its builder praise. It simply stood warm, quiet, and reliable through winters that erased other homes entirely, and that was enough, because on the frontier, the true measure of wisdom was never recognition. It was waking up alive when the storm finally passed,